Well, it's official. The new Windows terminal has been released. I've been looking forward to being able to make this video. You may have seen me talk about the new terminal back when it was in its early stages of development about last year, but finally it's out of beta and Microsoft released v1.0 of the new Windows terminal. If you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, basically the Windows terminal, it's not going to replace the command prompt and PowerShell that you may be familiar with. It's basically like a new interface that kind of combines them all together, and it's just way more customizable and just better in every way. First, as a little bit of technical background for context, basically the command prompt and the PowerShell, those are what are called consoles or terminals, and they basically interface with what's called the shell or the command line. So the command prompt is interfacing with the command line, which is basically the computer side of things, whereas the command prompt is like the human side of things, and it lets the computer and you talk to each other by issuing commands to the command line. So what this new terminal does is basically kind of puts all those together in one program, but allows you to run them at the same time. You can basically create new tabs, so you can create one tab with the command prompt, one tab with PowerShell that does PowerShell commands. So the original programs are not going anywhere. You can still search for command prompt and PowerShell and run those. And what's cool about this is it doesn't just support command prompt and PowerShell, it also supports other shells like the Linux bash command line if you have the Windows subsystem for Linux installed. So you can do, for example, Ubuntu, I have installed it, automatically detected that, and even like Azure, so if you have cloud servers running, it can do everything from one place. Now to get this new terminal, you do have to download it separately, but it's free. It's right on the Microsoft Windows Online Store, so you can just go into that, search for Windows Terminal, and then find it. There is a minimum system requirement, which is to have build version 18.362, which is like the May 2019 update. So if you've been relatively up to date with Windows, you should have no problem running it. So obviously we need to talk about why this new terminal is so great and what features it has over using the old command prompt or the old PowerShell. And like I said, all the commands are exactly the same because the underlying background computer interface is exactly the same. It's just the user interface skin basically that's changing. One of the major advantages of this new terminal is it is highly customizable in almost any way you can imagine. Now, the way to customize it is not exactly user-friendly, so you click the little drop-down arrow and then you click on settings and it'll bring up this settings text file in JSON format, so you will have to, be not afraid of dealing with what looks a little bit like code, but once you kind of understand what's going on, it's not too hard to figure out the parameters. Basically, in the settings file, anything you want to customize, you add that parameter in and then specify what you want the actual setting to be. So if you want to see what the default settings are, you can actually alt-click on the settings that you did before, and that'll open up the defaults settings file. Now, changing this will not do anything, so you don't want to bother changing this. Basically, you can use this as a reference to see what the default settings are, and if you want those to be different when you run the terminal, you can simply copy and paste that into the settings file and change it to how you want, and then it will run like that. You can also look at the documentations page and info on Microsoft's website. They have a list of all the parameters and all the documentation about what the different settings do and all the settings available that you can add into that settings file and customize it however you want. For example, you can customize the background in a lot of different ways. You can change the color, obviously, the opacity, and you can make it like an acrylic background, so it's kind of like a nice blurry where you can sort of see through it, and you can even change the opacity of that blurriness. But you don't have to do a solid color. You can even choose a background image, so you would add the link to that file in the settings and it would display that image in the background. You can change the opacity of that image, so it'll be like a combination of both the acrylic and the image. Looks very cool. And you can even change the position of the background image and the size of it. So some people have basically created almost like a little logo or icon in the corner, so it almost looks like some kind of hacker terminal. You can really do whatever you want with it, and it even supports animated GIFs as the background image, so you can do a ton of stuff with this if you want to just really make it your own. Also, you can obviously change a lot with the font and the color, so this is done by changing the settings, what's called a scheme. And there is a new font that's default called Cascadia, but you can choose any font you want. And for the font color, there are different schemes preset that you can choose from in the default settings file, and you can also see what each of these looks like on the Microsoft Documentations webpage. For example, I just chose the Campbell scheme because I thought it looked the best. But like I said, you can customize it further, so I wanted the Campbell scheme overall, but I also wanted all the standard text to be a pure white, whereas by default in this scheme, it's like a gray, so I just added a parameter to override the text, which is called the foreground parameter and made that pure white, so now that looks brighter. Now, like you saw, you can add multiple of the different types of consoles into different tabs. So the command prompt, PowerShell, Linux Bash, Ubuntu, whatever, and each of these has what's called a profile that you can customize in the settings. And what's cool is all of the customizations that I talked about already, you can customize by profile. So for example, for the background image, I actually created a different one for PowerShell than the command prompt. So for PowerShell, I wanted to be kind of like a blue background, so I actually added a nice little smooth blue background texture and added that as a background image, and then also made it a little bit acrylic. Whereas for the command prompt one tab, I wanted to actually just make that more black, like traditional, but I also wanted it to be a little bit acrylic so you can sort of see through it. So that also is a little bit different. So I customized those individually so they do look different. Also in the profile, there's other individual parameters you can set, such as the starting directory. So I wanted the starting directory to just be the C drive instead of the user folder, which is by default. So I added that in there. And while you can change all these settings individual within each profile, you can actually create global settings that applies to everything. There is a global settings area in the settings file. And there's also a bunch of ways to customize the actual launch settings of Terminal too. For example, when you first download the terminal, it'll probably launch the PowerShell as default, and then if you wanted to do command prompt, you'd have to create a new tab with that, but I wanted it to open command prompt by default, not PowerShell. So in the settings file, there is a parameter for default profile, and to do that, you just copy what's called the GUID, the long string of letters and numbers that's next to the command prompt profile, and then paste that next to the default profile setting, and then now it will launch the command prompt profile when I start up terminal by default. And there are some even cooler launch parameters that have to be used with a shortcut. So you basically create a shortcut on the desktop to the terminal, and then you add these to the end of the target box. So for example, you could have it launch with multiple tabs at once with different profiles in there, or you can even have, here's a cool thing, them split on the same window. So you can literally have a split pane window where the command prompt is on the top, for example, the PowerShell is on the bottom, you can have it on the left or right, and you can even split it multiple times where there's a big one on the left and then two smaller ones split on the right. You can do it however you want. It's awesome. And you can also resize it using Alt, Shift, and then the arrow keys to make it bigger or smaller. Now, if you're wondering, unfortunately, the only way to make the terminal launch by default with like multiple tabs or with the split pane is to create a shortcut with those weird commands in the target box. Apparently they're working on a way to just have those in the settings file, which would be nice and would make a whole bunch more sense. But right now, if you do want it to launch with more than one tab open automatically or multiple panes open, you would have to create a shortcut with those at the end of it. Though you can create custom keybinds that would allow you to just do all that automatically, maybe as soon as you start it up by pressing one button in the meantime. So that's all most of the customization features, but there's actually a lot more features that I haven't even covered yet. For example, the new terminal includes Unicode support, which yes, includes emojis. So yes, you can literally have the command prompt display emojis if you want. For some reason, it might be a bug right now. When you go to type in an emoji into the command prompt or PowerShell, but not the Linux Bash, it'll just show a weird icon like it can't display the emoji, but then if you do hit enter, it can display it back fine, so I think that's just a bug. And some people have customized it even further with like custom PowerShell plugins, so you can see on some screenshots, it'll have the directory line with like colored backgrounds with a cool arrow you can see. I haven't really been able to figure out how to do that. I tried. There is one guy named Scott Hanselman who works for Microsoft and made a blog post explaining how to do it. I couldn't really get it to work, but you might be able to do it. Another feature I briefly touched on is the ability to do custom key bindings. So you can have custom key binds in the settings that do pretty much whatever you want. So you can have it do automatically split a pane. You can have it open up a new tab by default or open up a new profile with different launch parameters. There's also a search function. So if you press Control-Shift-F, it'll bring up an actual search box and you can type in whatever you want there. And there's also a button to make it case sensitive or not if you want to search for something extremely specifically. Now, I mentioned that there's a new font called Cascadia, but there's actually a few different versions of it. So by default, the one it will use is called Cascadia Mono, but there is another one called Cascadia Code, which includes what's called ligatures, which basically combines different common coding characters into one. So for example, in a lot of coding languages, the exclamation mark and equal sign means not equal to. So it will literally convert those two characters, if you type them next to each other, into a not equal sign, that sort of thing. Though you do have to install that font separately, I believe. You can download it from the Microsoft. They have a GitHub page for those fonts, and then you just set that as the font in the settings file. Another really cool feature I thought is that the new Windows terminal can actually use Windows 10's built-in SSH client, where you can basically create a profile that will automatically connect to an SSH login. So like a remote shell, maybe you SSH into a server you have all the time where you don't want to have to, I don't know, log in or open up PuTTY or something like that. You can literally just create a profile in the dropdown where it would do that and then automatically connect through SSH right away. So that's pretty cool. And there are so many other different settings and customizations that I probably couldn't even get to all of them if I wanted to. You can look through the documentation page, which goes into detail about everything. There's stuff like changing tab names. You can change how copy and paste works. Right-clicking is default, but you can make it so it doesn't do it that way. You can also change the scrolling speed. You can change the Windows resize behavior and a ton more. And someone even made a GitHub page aggregating all the different weird custom themes people have made and posted on Reddit, so you can look through that if you want some inspiration. So yeah, maybe I'm just a huge nerd, but all of this does excite me because I do use the command prompt on occasion, so it's really cool that you can just customize it way more, and I don't know, I just think it's pretty cool. And Microsoft is still adding features to it. They're not done developing it now that 1.0 is out. And if you're wondering when version 2.0 is out, well, on the GitHub page, Microsoft does have the target date for that as May 31st, 2021, which is a year out, but that might just be a placeholder, but they are still working on features constantly, so you definitely should see updates and new features coming down the pipe, and I believe it does automatically update after you download it from the Windows Store, so you don't have to worry about that. So yeah, let me know what you think down in the comments. Are you going to download the new terminal? Are you going to customize it? We can talk about that down in the comments, and if you guys want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is talking about the new major Windows update, the May 2020 update. So if you want to see all the new major Windows features, you can just click that video right here. So thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.